May 27, 1996.
In the new Russia, organized crime is on a rampage.
As a rule, they are armed, very aggressive, and they're headed by very intelligent bosses.
And now the Wild East is heading west.
They had little respect for the United States law and little fear of American prisons.
Imagine Bonnie and Clyde gone international, because that's exactly what's happening.
We're police officers, and you're under arrest.
Tonight, the Russian mob in America. How dangerous is it?
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Chris Wallace.
The inner workings of the Mafia have come over the years and by way of Hollywood to be part of the popular lore of this country. Kissing the ring of the Godfather, making someone an offer he can't refuse. But while most of us were not watching, a new mob has become entrenched in the U.S., one with a Russian accent. In Brooklyn this week, federal prosecutors are scheduled to open their case against Vyacheslav Ivankov, a reputed godfather of the Russian mob who was accused of extortion. Authorities say in big cities across the U.S., Russian gangsters are involved in traditional crimes such as drugs and prostitution, as well as new ones, such as defrauding the government of millions in gas taxes. Police say the Russian mob combines remarkable financial sophistication with bone-crushing brutality, all the while sending hundreds of millions of dollars in cash every week back to Russia. Nightline's Dave Marish begins our coverage of the criminal organization that some say may soon become the most powerful in this country.
It's become a hallmark of the post-Soviet era of Russian history, the violence and death produced by organized crime. And even though Russian police do make occasional arrests, these successes have been buried beneath a mountain of unsolved crimes.
I have been asked to testify today about Russian organized crime in the United States.
Recently on Capitol Hill, a parade of hidden witnesses detailed how Russian crime has gone international and has spread its bloodshed here.
After leaving the restaurant, Valdemir was shot and killed.
Convicted American Mafia underboss Anthony Gaspipe Queso described how his men had killed one Russian mobster who had threatened another who was tied to Queso's mob family.
Murad was very thankful that we had gotten rid of his problem. We couldn't let somebody try to put a squeeze of our family's biggest moneymaker.
Gaspipe Queso's hit took place in the Russian immigrant-filled Brooklyn neighborhood of Brighton Beach. That's where a dozen years ago, then New York City Police Commissioner Robert McGuire first noticed a new generation of criminal gangs, immigrants from the Russian underworld.
The Russian organized crime elements have basically seen a money tree or a honeypot here in the United States.
For formerly Russian con men Michael and David Shmushkovitz, the American money tree bloomed enticingly on the West Coast.
Southern California for a long time has been known as one of the fraud capitals in the United States.
Lee Michelson, who prosecuted the Shmushkovitz brothers, says they fit right in with a medical insurance fraud scheme that's put them in the Hustlers Hall of Fame.
Well, the scale was absolutely massive. It was beyond question the largest healthcare fraud that's been prosecuted in this country, with literally more than $2 billion worth of fraudulent claims submitted.
The Shmushkovitz fraud involved billing medical insurers, including Medicaid and Medicare, for thousands of unnecessary and often unperformed lab tests and medical examinations. It had several characteristics typical of the ex-Russian crime gangs. Number one, real white-collar sophistication. Number two, exploitation of an immigrant community often unwilling to cooperate with police. And number three, a shelter in the corrupt Russian banking system.
The possibilities for bank fraud, money laundering, electronic wire transfer fraud between Russia and the United States is going to be very, very difficult, because we're unable to follow the trail of money on the Russian banking side.
West Coast police have had success in busting a network of chop shops servicing a gang of former Soviet car thieves, which operated along Interstate 5 that runs up the Pacific coast from the Mexican to the Canadian border, and in thwarting the kidnapping of this young girl, and in breaking up this remarkably high-profile extortion plot.
Professional hockey players from the former Soviet Union are also victims of extortions.
This hidden witness, once a top Russian mobster, detailed for senators the plots against Alexander Mogilny of the Vancouver Canucks and the former Los Angeles Kings defenseman, Alexei Zhitnik.
A man named Sasha, who I know connected with Russian criminal group, appreciate Alexei and demand money from him. Sasha was sending Alexei a warning to make sure he thought about his future in Los Angeles.
This is gasoline. This is what they started.
But the most popular scheme of ex-Russian mobsters, the senators were told, involves adulterating gasoline with cheaper fuels to rip off consumers and cheat Uncle Sam of tax money. American mobster Michael Franzese says he and some ex-Russian partners made this scam sing.
The combined Russian IRISA organization, which I controlled, defrauded the United States government and the states and counties of New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida out of hundreds of millions of tax dollars due on the sale of gasoline.
Marriages of the Italian-American Mafia and ex-Russian gangs are still exceptional, says California Attorney General Dan Lundgren. But Lundgren says the links between criminal gangs across ethnic lines are increasing, as are the links among local ex-Russian gangs across the USA.
It's not just a California problem or not just a New York or Eastern Seaboard problem, but rather wherever these individuals have an opportunity to operate, it could be a problem. And so we need to allow victims to know that this is something that we in law enforcement are concerned about on the local, the state, and the federal level.
To Senator William Roth, the chairman of these hearings, the requirement is bigger than that. Not just a national effort against the ex-Soviet gangs, but a global one.
For too long, the international borders that these criminals routinely ignore have served as obstacles for law enforcement. We must work together as nations to overcome these obstacles instead of allowing criminals to use them as gateways to freedom.
Law enforcement experts seem to agree the Russian mobs hardly rival the older, more established Italian-American and Latin American crime syndicates, for now. But they all say this is a potential crisis that can and must be nipped in the bud. I'm Dave Marish for NightLine in Washington.
When we come back, a New York cop who tracks the Russian mob, an author who has researched just how big it is, and a journalist who cautions against comparing it to the Mafia. Joining us now in our New York studio, Ralph Cefarello is a detective who has been investigating Russian organized crime in New York for the past 3 years. Stephen Handelman is the former Moscow bureau chief for the Toronto Star and the author of Comrade Criminal, a study of the Russian Mafia. Alexander Grant is the news editor of New Russian Word, the largest Russian language paper in the U.S. Detective, when we hear about the Mafia, we think about godfathers and crime families. Is the Russian mob as organized, as structured as the Mafia?
No, I don't believe that at this point they're as organized as the Mafia. I wouldn't say there were 5 families like there are in New York. There are structured groups, and they are very friendly with each other. They know each other. Most of these groups, if there's some way of making money, will get involved with another group. One group will get involved with another group, but as far as structure, it's still in the making at this point.
We mentioned Ivankov at the beginning of the broadcast. Are there Russian godfathers?
What the equivalent of a Russian godfather, the equivalent of a godfather with the traditional organized crime, would be someone like Ivankov at this point. Supposedly he came here to structure the loose-knit groups that are in New York City.
Mr. Handelman, the Russian mob seems to specialize in a different kind of crime. As we mentioned, these highly sophisticated financial transactions. These aren't common criminals, are they?
No, I think that one of the reasons the Russian Mafia is such a menace to us is because it has both a loose structure here and a very tight structure back home. These, after all, are gangs that have developed out of the Soviet system and Soviet society, and they've got a great deal of contempt and for the rest of the world, as well as an ability to run circles around most law enforcement agencies. After all, they figure they've defied the KGB, and the FBI is not going to be much of a problem after that.
For all of their sophistication, though, they are just as brutal as the Mafia, aren't they?
Well, they really are. I can remember President Reagan in the 1980s talking about the evil empire in the Soviet Union, and now it's really true. What you see is a vast network of groups that are operating largely out of the old center of the Soviet Union in Russia and making contacts in the former Soviet republics, moving out to Europe, and now they've come into North America in a big way. But since they're a much smaller group, they usually come in over the radar screen, and they're very shrewd businessmen, so you don't often realize that what you're dealing with is a criminal group. He could be a fellow in Armani suits or a banker. He's not your typical film star godfather.
Mr. Grant, one of the centers of mob activity in this country is the Russian community in Brooklyn known as Little Odessa. Give us a flavor of that. Just how openly does the mob operate there?
Whenever we are talking about Russian crime in New York City, we do divide it into two main groups, so-called old guard and newcomers. Old guard, as detective said before, maybe 200 hardcore criminals who arrived into the United States among so-called Brezhnev or Jewish immigration. They knew each other very well, and there was a loose structure. They were meeting together and dispersing, committing their crimes, relaxing together, having a fun, shooting each other from time to time. But there's a very close circle. Now it's extremely different situation. It's a huge market of unknown persons.
If I can add something to what Alexander said, Alexander is right that there have been two waves of different types of Russian criminals, but one of the interesting things that separates the new wave, rather the post-Soviet gangs who've come over here from the original emigres, is that money actually isn't a major preoccupation. Obviously, every criminal wants as much as he can, but what's interesting because of the Russian and post-Soviet context is a lot of these gangs are very closely tied in with the political structure and the bureaucratic structure back home. And the real name of the game is power and political influence. So what you're seeing back in Russia, which is mirrored now in the West, is a fight for the spoils of the old system, which very often reveals itself, manifests itself in power struggles back in Russia itself.
Let me just ask you to answer this question briefly, if you can, Mr. Handelman, because we have to get a break in here. Does the Russian mob in Russia run the Russian mob in the U.S., or is it a homegrown, separate variety here?
Well, there are clearly links. We're not really sure exactly what those links are. Vyacheslav Ivankov, who came over here several years ago on a false passport, a false visa, was a godfather, a Russian vory zakone, or as they say, a thief-in-law, back in Russia itself, according to Russian police. Now, he is one of about 7 or 10 of what Russian police consider the central leadership of the thieves world, which is what the thieves, the mafia societies are called back in Russia itself. But there's no...
Gentlemen, we do have to take a break here. Let me break in just for a moment. When we return, though, I want to ask you all how U.S. authorities are doing now in fighting the Russian mob and just how powerful the mob is going to become in this country. And we'll be back in a moment. And we're back now with New York detective Ralph Cifarello, author Stephen Handelman, and Russian journalist Alexander Grant. Detective, in recent years, U.S. authorities have succeeded in penetrating the Mafia and taking down some of their kingpins. How are you all doing fighting the Russian mob?
I believe we're doing fairly well in New York City and across the country. I talk very often with detectives from California and Boston, Miami, and what we do is in New York we're having meetings once a month between New York City detectives, customs, INS, probation, and we're sharing information that we get on these criminals. What we're trying to do is stop it before it gets out of hand. And we have the backing of New York City Police Department. The police commissioner is very interested in this at this time.
How big a unit do you have in New York City to fight the Russian mob?
Right now, we just started a new unit with a sergeant and 6 detectives, 2 of which speak Russian. But that's just people that do the initial investigation. We have backup, of course, from as many detectives as we could possibly need. At any time, we can call on someone to come and help.
Let me bring in Mr. Grant, if I can, at this point. Mr. Grant, what's your sense? How effective have federal and local authorities been in penetrating the Russian mob?
Well, I think it's not so optimistic as detectives said, because whenever I confronted some my own sources or interviewing law enforcement agencies, I've been answered all the time the same thing, that law enforcement agencies in their fighting Russian organized crime have a lot of secret sources and a lot of informants, but very few of persons who are agreed to be legal witnesses. Russian community is supposed to be very uncooperative, and I can understand them because they are indoctrinated that any person in uniform or any law enforcement officer is their enemy, not their friend. This indoctrination been born in the former Soviet Union. It takes time to get rid of it. And that is why...
I may,
pardon?
Go ahead, Detective.
If I may, yes, the Russian public at large do believe that they have a problem coming to the police at this time. It's because of where they came from, the type of police they were introduced to there. It's a different thing here. I see it myself loosening up. I do see more people that are willing to come forward because we have proven ourselves, I believe, at some point that we can protect them and protect their families. I know that the FBI and NVD are meeting and talking, and that may be even helpful in our fight to protect their families in Russia.
Mr. Grant,
if I can say,
let me finish up if I can. Mr. Grant, is there a Russian equivalent to the code of silence that you hear about in the Mafia, not to cooperate with authorities and not to inform on your fellow Russians?
Well, the thing is that it's really desperate situation. Then law enforcement agency knows more that it can do. They have a lot of hidden information. They know about who is who, but they cannot bust him and put on trial because they have no enough legal evidence for prosecutors. That's a problem number one, I think. But it's a possible problem because working in a Russian newspaper, I myself have more and more calls to the paper offices from the persons who are ready to testify. And maybe in the nearest future the situation will be changed to better, but now it's not good.
Mr. Handelman, how much of a threat does the Russian mob represent at this point, and where do you see it headed?
Well, I think if I could just tack on to what Mr. Grant was saying, there is an intricate code, in fact, that goes much further back even than Soviet times. The Russian gang societies have their own code of honor.
Exactly,
which is a very non-materialistic collective kind of code, which means that in the old days, even the godfathers weren't allowed to marry. And what has to be kept in mind in
never
assessing...
to work, never to marry, never to have a telephone in the apartment.
That's right. What's important to keep in mind, I think, in dealing with, for law enforcement agencies dealing with this particular threat, is that one agency or in one city, even in one country, can't possibly cope with it alone. The most important development in the last year or so is to see various federal agencies beginning to work together with agencies in other countries, and even more importantly in Russia itself. Because the gangs are such a difficult, and mobsters are such a difficult organization to capture, either through penetrating them with informants or with offering them plea bargaining, and particularly because they deal in, for the most part, in economic crimes, which means you have to bring in Treasury, the IRS, and a lot of other agencies who can handle sophisticated crimes like money laundering. Without that, you really don't have a chance.
Mr. Handelman, let me bring you back to the question I was going to ask you earlier. Mr. Handelman, how much of a threat does the Russian mob represent in this country now, and where do you see it headed?
I think it's a threat in the sense that the development of Russian criminal activities here will present a certain danger of violence as some of the gangs themselves begin to fight over turf. There certainly is evidence as well that there's drug running and gun running and smuggling of gold and minerals going on through North America back into Russia. But there's a danger, I think, that's even worse, which very few people have really talked about, which is that if Russia itself begins to succumb to the power of these gangs, then what we have is a geopolitical problem of instability in a country which about 4 years ago we assumed was now one for democracy and an end to the Cold War.
We're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you.